Hey, in this lesson, we are going to be looking at JSON and using JSON data directly within our JavaScript code. So let's go ahead and create another JS file. Just call this one app2.js and then create that new file within the same directory, and we'll just save it as app2.js. I've also still got the editor opened on the left-hand side, and as well, I've got my browser window opened on the right-hand side, going over to the index page that's serving up the app2.js. And there's more information available about JSON at the Mozilla Developer Network. So JSON contains data, and it's really easy to parse that data and make use of it within JavaScript. JSON is short for JavaScript object notation, and converting values from JSON to JavaScript allows you to really easily use the data. There are some key differences within JavaScript and JSON. So we saw in the previous lessons that we can create objects and arrays. Within the property names of the objects, they need to be double-quoted strings, and trailing commas are forbidden. So if for instance, you have a trailing comma, and a trailing comma is something like where you've got a person, and let's just do a very simple one here. So if we have a trailing comma within JavaScript, this person is still going to be okay. But because we do have this trailing comma, it's expecting another value with the comma separation. So that's where we're not able to add in the trailing comma. So that one's going to cause a problem if it's JSON data. There's a number of places that you can go to lint JSON data to make sure that it's valid JSON. You can type into the search engine JSON lint and go to any one of the ones that show up and select your JSON data, copy, paste it into the validator, and you'll see that it's going to throw an error because we have that excess comma, but once we remove the comma, we have once again valid JSON. So that is important to have not have the trailing, and as well to have the double quotes around the property names. So even though this will work within JavaScript, it's not going to work within as valid JSON. So it's always a good idea, even when you're writing just JavaScript, if you do work a lot with JSON, to make sure that it is properly structured JSON. It's not going to hurt the JavaScript, and it'll help you familiarize yourself a lot more with how to construct JSON data. So leading zeros are prohibited within numbers. So that means that if we have a number value and we have a leading zero, and I'll just move this to the next line. We'll do a wrap there, and then I'll console log out whatever we've got for person within JavaScript. So if we go back to the console, that's fine. It still outputs it as 1. But if I was to take this JavaScript object and paste it in here and do a validate JSON, it's going to throw an error because it's expecting that this value is not going to have the leading zeros. Also, decimal point must be followed by at least 1 digit, and non and infinity are unsupported. So those are the key differences between JavaScript and JSON. They've got some more information on the breakdown of what type of values you can have. So you can have a Boolean value, you can have null, you can have a number, a string, an object, or an array. So those are also the common ones that we're using within JavaScript as well. There's also methods that are listed in here, and we're going to look at more of those in detail and coming up, JSON parse and JSON stringify. So let's go ahead and copy this information and create a JSON file and then bring that into our JavaScript. So as long as it's got a JS extension, this is going to run as a JavaScript file. So in some cases, you might see that somebody might indicate that there's an object and they have a JS, but they're still defining the object value. In a true JSON file, you'd be using the extension .json and just having the JSON data sitting within there. And then that would be valid JSON data so that you could access that data file from any scripting language, and in this case we are going to be using JavaScript. So let's go ahead and create a new file and copy the JSON data into the new file, and then I'm going to save this as a JSON file. So we'll call it J1 JSON, and that's our JSON file, and we're going to also now access this using JavaScript. So instead of defining the value of person and logging out the value of person, we're going to make a fetch request to the JSON file and then return that value as usable information into our JavaScript. So let's go ahead and make a fetch, and let's clear that out and go back into here, and we'll create a function that's going to call it myJSON. And what this function will do is this will make a fetch request, and the request is going to go to the web URL, and in this case wherever we've got our JSON data is going to be the URL that we're looking for. So that's the J1 JSON file. And because it's on the same directory, we're making a fetch request. To read up on fetch, there's more information, Mozilla Developer Network using fetch, and it's got an example here. So fetch does work off of promises. So the idea for fetch is that we make a request to wherever the endpoint is. So in this case, it's going to be the JSON file. We're returning back a response from that endpoint, and the response, if it is JSON data, there's also a method that is called JSON, and this is a method that defines the body mixin, and basically it transforms the JSON. It's expecting JSON, it transforms it into a usable data object, so returning back the JSON into a JSON format, and it's not going to come back as a string. If you're using the JSON method, it returns it back as an object, and this then is a usable object in JavaScript. So we're going to return back as data, and then here in this example, they're logging out the data. So we're going to do the exact same thing. So pressing and doing a fetch request to the URL. And then once we make the connection, we're going to wait for the response object. And then within the response, using the function arrow notation, taking that response object and then the built-in JSON method, returning the content then back as JSON. And then we can use that as, I'll give it a variable name of JSON. And then what we want to do with the returned content is simply use it within the console, and we're returning back data. So we're outputting the data into the console. And this actually should be JSON because we're referencing the variable name as JSON. So that's going to be returning back the content from this file and outputting it into the console. So there we've got the contents of the JSON file, and you can also extend on this as well to add in more items into the JSON file. So let's update and do first and add in a first name for there, and once again that just gets output into the console. If you want to make use of the data, you can always set a global variable, and let's assign a global variable, and we'll just call it data, and just assign blank value to it. And then once we do get the JSON data coming back from the console, then we can assign to data, so to the global value of data, the JSON content, and then we can make use of it. And oftentimes when you are returning back the data, then within this function, or you're going to pass the data into another function that's going to handle the output of the data. So this is just one way that if you are using it within a global object and you want to load more content into that global object, then you can make use of the data, because once again, this is promise based. So you do have to make and wait till the connection is complete, the new data is loaded before you can use it within your JavaScript code. So to practice creating a JSON file, go ahead and construct a JSON file. Go over to JSON lint, just make sure that it is a valid JSON file, and then using JavaScript fetch, make a request to where your JSON file is located and output the contents of the file into your console, and you're going to be ready to move on to the next lesson. So before the next lesson, create a valid JSON file. Make sure and go check that it is a valid JSON file, a JSON validator. Then using JavaScript fetch, connect to the contents of the file, and lastly output the contents of the file into the console using JavaScript.